At the start of 1944, the U.S. Navy's Central Pacific Offensive was going relatively well. Admiral Spruance had led Task Force 58 and its attached forces in the invasions of Tarawa and Makin, and then on into the Marshall Islands. By the end of January 1944, the question on the minds of the upper echelons of the U.S. Navy was, where do we go next? Spruance suggested Enoch, the westernmost of the larger Marshall Islands, a couple of 100 miles west of the later-to-be-famous Bikini Atoll. But this idea came with a caveat: extending this far west would bring U.S. forces into striking range of the mysterious Japanese fortress base of Truk, and so that would need dealing with first. Truk had occupied the minds of U.S. planners for quite some time now. Not a huge amount was known about it. It was one of the islands the Japanese had occupied in World War I, and much like the Marshalls themselves. Ever since then, the Japanese Navy hadn't really been all that keen on letting visitors in. What was known about it was that it was the largest Japanese Navy base outside of the home islands, even more important than Rabaul, and it served as a conduit for aircraft heading to frontline bases, and large portions of the Japanese Navy were also known to spend time there waiting for their next assignment based on experience in the AFF-mentioned landing operations, as well as others further south in the Guadalcanal and Solomon Islands campaigns. It was supposed the Truk must be insanely heavily fortified and capable of dispatching significant forces to threaten any U.S. fleet that was operating nearby. Essentially, it was a Japanese version of what Pearl Harbor had become in the past few years. Up until very recently, it had also been completely out of range of U.S. recon aircraft. And once again, the recent landings had shown that submarine-based recon information was of relatively limited use if the fortifications were well camouflaged, and the Japanese were very good at camouflaging things. And it was true. Truk was a very large base. It had very large anchorages and numerous port facilities that allowed it to support a whole fleet and regular cargo shipments heading to and from Japan. There was also a seaplane base and a number of airfields. However, contrary to intelligence estimations, the base had never actually been especially heavily fortified. This was a combination of the assumption that the massive fleet of warships and hundreds of aircraft that the base could support should be more than enough defense if anything did come too close, and the fact that Truk was over 1,000 miles away from what the Japanese had planned to be their front lines. Of course, by the beginning of 1944, those front lines had moved considerably closer, and thus there was a crash program to fortify the base and expand existing facilities. But that effort had only really gotten going in the previous few months, regardless of whether or not there were any defenses there, though Spruance was absolutely right to be worried about the island's offensive punch, even if not a single warship sailed, and with the U.S. Navy getting closer, the carriers, battleships, and heavy cruisers that had populated the lagoon for much of 1942 and 43 had mostly been relocated elsewhere. There was still the matter of several hundred aircraft, which might cause problems for an essentially stationary invasion fleet off any Weto Truk, would absolutely have to be neutralized first in order to work out just what they might be facing. The U.S. Navy dispatched a pair of U.S. Marine Corps Liberators. These particular bombers had been converted to reconnaissance duty, and they duly arrived over Truk on the 4th of February 1944. This revealed half a dozen large cruisers, 2 carriers, and the giant battleship Mushi still there just over a month. Previously, Yamato had also been present, but she'd been torpedoed at the end of 1943 by USS Skate and was back in Japan for repairs. The Japanese, of course, recognized the signs of what was to come, and within days all major remaining elements of the Japanese Navy had weighed anchor and sailed off to other ports. Although this would deny the U.S. Navy some juicy targets, these recon flights did have an unexpected side benefit. Thinking that the recon flights meant that a U.S. attack was imminent, all Japanese aircraft on Truk were put on high alert. Then a week passed, and no attack. They stayed on alert. Another week was over, almost completely exhausted from near enough a fortnight on high alert, standing by their aircraft 24/7. The Japanese pilots were finally stood down for a bit of a rest, just in time for the Americans to show up. The main striking power of the U.S. Fifth Fleet comprised 2 elements: Task Group 50.99 under Vice Admiral Lee, which contained every single operational fast battleship, then flying the Stars and Stripes, this being USS Iowa, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Alabama, South Dakota, and North Carolina. Up until the start of the month, they'd also counted Washington and Indiana on their strength, but the two had collided and were off for repairs. Missouri and Wisconsin were still fitting out, and had yet to commission. The other element was Task Group 58. This was split into 4 subgroups. Task Force 58.4, with the carriers Saratoga, Princeton, and Langley, had been left behind, as their role was to support the invasion of any Weto, which was to be timed to start its preliminaries at the same time as the attack on Truk got underway, with the main invasion kicking off just after the raids had ended. The other 3 subgroups Task Forces 58. 1.2 and 3 had 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers on their roster: the Essex-class USS Essex, Yorktown Intrepid, and Bunker Hill. The stalwart Yorktown-class USS Enterprise, last of her class at this point, and the Independence-class USS Belleau Wood, Cabo Monterey, and Calp. In between them, they were carrying 589 aircraft, including 16 specially adapted aircraft, a mix of F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsair, which were set up explicitly for night fighting enterprise, also carried some Avengers that were designed for night strikes. More on them later. Admiral Spuren, noting the importance of the operation, had shifted his flag from the cruiser USS Indianapolis to the battleship USS New Jersey. As Indianapolis was remaining back at Weto, he left the carriers under the direct command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. This massive strike force, which included over 3 dozen cruisers and destroyers, as well as the Afion capital units, would spend just over 4 days sailing west to their planned launch point, a mere 90 nautical miles northeast of Truk, arriving on station on the night of the 16th of February, ready for a launch to commence in the pre-dawn MC of the morning of the 7th. Now, just a quick note before we continue. When you look at accounts of the attack on Truk, you will sometimes see confusing dates mentioned. Some accounts will say that the attacks took place over the 16th and 17th of February. Others say the attacks took place over the 17th and 18th of February. This is essentially thanks to record-keeping issues, because the US up to and including Hawaii, Midway, and obviously Pearl Harbor on Hawaii are all to the east of the international date line, whereas the Marshall Islands and Truk are to the west of the international date line. So essentially it depends on if you're looking at records officially kept for, when the strikes were occurring physically, but as recorded by US chroniclers on the east side of the international date line, or if you're looking at local time, which is, when the strikes are actually occurring for the people who are actually there. In any case, unknown to US forces at the time, the score had actually already been opened. The submarine USS Skate, which was still prowling the waters around Truk, after only managing to damage, Yam had managed to find the light cruiser Agano, which had been leaving Truk on the 16th. She'd previously been hit by a torpedo from an Avenger whilst anchored in Rahl, and then by another torpedo from the USS Scamp, while she was on her way to Truk for pairs from that first torpedo hit. Finally patched up enough to make it back to Japan, she was heading that way, when another pair of torpedoes, this time obviously from Skate, slammed into her, leaving her mortally wounded. The escorting destroyer O began to take off survivors before Agano sank in the early hours of the 17th, although she was sunk over 150 miles away from Truk itself. Agano could technically be described as the operation's first victim, but back to the carriers. 90 minutes before dawn, 5 of the carriers began launching Hellcats, once they were all airborne. These squadron elements combined into a 72-plane group that raced in mostly at low level, with only 90 nautical miles to cover. They'd be arriving over Truk just as dawn broke. Fighters from Bunker Hill were providing top cover and scouting elements, while Enterprise and Yorktown's aircraft were the main low-altitude attack group. Intrepid and Essex had provided Hellcats that were coming in slightly further back, still at an intermediate height, to back up whichever of the low or high groups might need assistance. But there was very little Japanese resistance at first. The Japanese radar installations were, broadly speaking, similar INC capabilities to the chain home stations of the Battle of Britain. This included being unable to spot low-altitude attackers, which meant that the alert had only really just about gone out when they spotted Intrepid's higher-flying aircraft, which was sitting slightly back compared to the low-level racing attack formation, and thus this allowed the US aircraft to close in pretty much on top of Truk before the sirens sounded. This was compounded by the aforementioned exhausted Japanese pilots being on leave, which happened to be on a separate small island in the chain, and thus this meant that when the alarm went off, they all had to run along a long causeway to the main airfield, before they could even start to think about boarding their aircraft. And getting airborne, of the hundreds of Japanese aircraft of all types present on truk, only a few dozen were able to scramble just minutes before the US attack arrived. Struggling to gain altitude, and massively outnumbered, they would still do their best. The US fighters, on the other hand, didn't waste any time in heading in to strafe the fields and other ground targets, and the Japanese aircraft, seeing this unfold, immediately headed after them. But there were two rather large factors working against the defenders. Firstly, thanks to the US program of rotating experienced pilots home to teach others. Although many of the US flyers that day were relatively green, they'd received a brutal education in air-to-air combat by some of the best early war fighter pilots the US Navy had to offer. And so they spotted the Japanese fighters and turned to meet them, instead of just being jumped, as that battle unfilled a relatively evenly matched one. In terms of overall numbers, the high and medium altitude groups of hellcats rolled in, and suddenly the fight was extremely uneven indeed, with over twice as many hellcats as Japanese fighters, and coming in from all altitudes. More Japanese aircraft were struggling into the sky. There were 5 airfields, and thus quite a number of runways, but a good number of these aircraft were shot due. As they began to claw their way skywards, others, their immediate fuel reserves and ammunition expended in the early portion of the air battle, were trying to land, and many of these were hit either on their way down or as they taxied, having successfully landed. Soon the airfields were littered with the burning remains of all sorts of Japanese Navy and Japanese Army aircraft, and the hellcats were spreading out to look for other targets, which included a number of Japanese ships in or near the lagoon, who were apparently in various stages of making a break for it, but a mere 72 hellcats was nowhere near the end of it. Mitchell had decided to try out a new tactic, which was somewhat reminiscent of the tactics the Keto Pi themselves had used but turned up to 11. In the early part of the war, the US Navy's carriers would have launched their entire aircraft complement and then sent it out as a single group. This was slow, inefficient, and burned an awful lot of fuel on the early launched aircraft, which just had to circle waiting for everybody else. The Japanese Navy, on the other hand, launched elements of each carrier's air group, which provided a larger collective strike package, and then followed up with further waves, with each carrier alternating its contribution between torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. This allowed multiple balanced strike waves to be sent into battle relatively swiftly. The US Navy had begun to adapt this approach for its own carriers. Indeed, the large fighter contingent that was currently shooting anything that moved, and some things that didn't, but still exploded nicely when hit, had been launched in just such a manner. But with so many aircraft and so many flight decks available to him, Mitchell had decided that once his first big strike has established air superiority, instead of sending in staggered waves of attack, he was just going to keep hitting the Japanese for pretty much the rest of the day. To that end, scarcely 30 minutes after the fighters had left, and indeed while they were still en route, a batch of Avengers carrying incendiar and other bombs suitable for making a mess of airfields had taken off, and with the Japanese fighters either shot down or tangled up with the hellcats, they now showed up, punched straight through the dying aerial melee, and added even more fire to the growing conflagre that had previously been one of the most powerful Japanese airbase complexes in the Southwest Pacific. And it didn't stop there. The fleet and light carriers now began launching wave after wave of aircraft, with each mixed launch sending almost 24 dive bombers and around half as many torpedo bombers and a similar number of fighters into the sky, with so many holes available each strike wave, which totaled around about 4 aircraft, could be launched using only some of the carrier flight decks, which allowed the other carriers to either be warming the next set of launches to go into the air minutes later, or eventually, as the day wore on, to start recovering some of the first aircraft they'd launched as they returned. Now bombs and torpedoes were sent in earnest at Japanese shipping, as well as the tougher airfield installations, the only exception being the massive aviation and ship fuel tanks. These were earmarked for the last wave of attackers, primarily on the grounds that if you set fire to several thousand tons of oil fuel so early, it would likely burn with such vigor that the smoke would make the job of subsequent pilots to hit other targets considerably more difficult, and so the bulk of the daytime attacks aimed to crater the runways with heavy bombs which would deny their further use to the enemy for some time, and of course to sink as many ships as possible. Soon Japanese vessels began to fall. The cruiser Naha had been spotted outside the lagoon on a course for home. She was attacked repeatedly before a torpedo strike, coupled with a direct hit from a large bomb, broke her in two, and she sank pretty quickly. Lieutenant Bridges, piloting an Avenger from Intrepid's VT-6, set out a textbook perfect torpedo attack on a large target. Unfortunately for him, this turned out to be the 10,000-ton Ayokumaru, which was stocked to the brim with ammunition. The ship duly took a hit and almost instantly vanished in an apocalyptic explosion. When the smoke cleared, the broken remains of the ship were rapidly vanishing beneath the waves. But the Avenger had also vanished without a trace elsewhere. Japanese destroyers were dropping like flies. Fumizuki was mortally damaged and would sink via leaks over the next 24 hours. Takik Kaz was torpedoed and sunk outright. Matsuk Kaz and Shur were both hit and badly damaged to varying degrees, and more than a dozen merchant ships of various descriptions were also all sent to the bottom. Now followed the most controversial element of the entire engagement: the cruiser Katori, the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru, the armed trawler Shonan Maru. Number 15. And the destroyer Mars and Noaki were making their way to Japan. Having left Truk shortly before the attacks began, they were spotted by inbound U.S. aircraft, and Mitchell directed one of the many strike waves to go after them. However, Spruance was also in receipt of this information, and he ordered the battleship Iowa, the cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, and 4 destroyers to head out to intercept as well. Then from the flag bridge of USS Newar's Jersey, he ordered his ship to join the chase in addition, compared to his usual calculated self. This was a somewhat uncharacteristic move. The aircraft should easily destroy the Japanese force, and if they didn't, well, there were plenty more strike waves ready to go and have another shot. But perhaps Spruance was just bored or frustrated at being mostly a spectator to yet another victory that he was as sensibly commanding. Or perhaps he just didn't want Mitchell to get all the kills, as the two didn't really get along all that well at this stage. Or perhaps as a battleship and cruiser officer pre-war, he just wanted to get the big guns working for a change. Whatever the case, the aircraft were faster, and they got there first. Mars was damaged by a near miss. Katori was hit hard by bombs, and Akagi Maru was also badly hit as the surface group closed in. A lone Japanese aircraft made an attempt to bomb Iowa, but missed, and a pilot from Enterprise who was orbiting nearby noticed the smoke from the damaged Japanese formation, the first strike wave having left, and invited all other nearby aircraft via radio to finish them off, only to almost immediately have his message counterterm, made by Mitchell Spew's force, had reached gun range, and neither admiral wanted any confusion to arise over who was going to finish these ships off well, and avoiding friendly fire as well. Well, soon, hails of 16-in, 8-in and 5-in shells were crashing down around the Japanese formation, which fought back with determination. Even though they were completely outmatched, Kutu eventually rolled over and sank with massive shell holes showing in her hull, going down with her guns. Still firing, my car predictably lost a fight with pretty much every single rapid-firing gun in the US fleet that could be brought to bear, but she did manage to get her torpedoes off at the very last minute, likewise going down with her AR gun still firing at the New Jersey. An orbiting US aircraft spotted the torpedo launch, and New Jersey and Iowa managed to maneuver to avoid being hit as the underwater weapons passed by. Sprue remarked that would have been embarrassing. The only survivor of the encounter was the Noaki, which had decided discretion was very definitely the better part of valor, and promptly hightailed it, while everyone else was occupied dodging and weaving under a curtain of water and splinters from the guns of the Iowa and New Jersey. She managed to escape, with the only damage being splinters from near misses. The coda to this little encounter being the 450-ton subchaser CH-24, which was spotted as the sun set. The destroyer USS Burns was sent to investigate, and upon closing in, the tiny CH-24 opened fire on the much larger destroyer with its deck gun, a little 3-in model. Unsurprisingly, it was almost immediately sunk by Burns's much superior main battery. Undoubtedly, the entire affair could have been concluded by aircraft much faster and with significantly less risk, but this would also be the only time that those 2 US battleships actually got to fire their guns in anger at a significant enemy warship, and so they wrapped up the evening by finishing a broad circle of truk with their largest battle ensigns flying, which was a power move if you've ever seen one. Darkness fell, and now the Imperial Japanese Navy would exact a small measure of revenge. A handful of surviving Kate torpedo bombers were circling the US fleet, mostly staying outside of anti-aircraft gun range, and then just before midnight, a lone aircraft was spotted making a bind for US carriers. It was so locked on, it was concluded that perhaps this aircraft, like some of the US Avengers, had been equipped with some kind of radar. In any case, a radar-equipped Hellcat was ordered to go and intercept, but the enemy aircraft flew so low that the fighter couldn't get a decent return on its scope, amidst all the clutter from the sea, and visual conditions were such that night that spotting the bomber by eye proved to be impossible as well. Then, just 4 miles away from the nearest carrier, the Japanese aircraft vanished off the scopes entirely, but with no big splash indicating it might have run into the sea. At this last moment, the US ships had to conclude the worst and make evasive turns. But it was too late. The carrier USS Intrepid was suddenly shaken by a torpedo hit on her starboard side, just after which jammed the rudders. Come dawn, she'd have to head back under escort for any wok after her steering was fixed. But it wasn't over yet. Enterprise was carrying a dozen radar-equipped Avengers of VT-10. Remember we mentioned those earlier. These were now sent out in the early morning hours and would score over a dozen direct hits on enemy ships that had presumed they were relatively safe from pinpoint attacks in the hours of darkness the following day. As the sun rose, further conventional strikes headed in to finish off damaged ships and pick off any that had been missed, as well as further adding to the destruction present on the airfields. Just after dawn, the destroyer O, which was heading back to Truk with the survivors of the Agano, was spotted and torpedoed, despite her best efforts on her approach, sinking with the loss of most of her own crew and the over 500 survivors from the Agano who were below deck by noon on the second day. Though it was pretty clear that there actually wasn't all that much left of value on Truk that wasn't already on fire or sinking, and so the US formation peeled off and headed back to further support the landings over at NEW Talk in their wake. They left the wrecks of 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 4 smaller warships, 3 armed merchant cruisers, 20 transports of various descriptions, 2 submarine tenders and 5 tankers, with almost a dozen other ships damaged to one degree or another, around 177,000 tons of precious fuel, a mixture of ship oil and aviation fuel, was burning away merrily, and about 2/3 of all the aircraft present on the island at the beginning had been shot down or destroyed on the ground, along with most of the supplies that had been stored there. Truk was essentially dead as far as being a major naval base was concerned, and although it would remain in use as an airbase in future MO, its threat was diminished enough that the US would, after a few follow-up strikes later in the year, decide simply to bypass it, as it just wasn't worth the cost in troops to take it. US losses amounted to the damage to Intrepid, mentioned a minute ago, and 25 aircraft lost, with 40 sailors and airmen also gone. A dozen of them had been lost in the attack on Inrid, and the rest had gone down with their aircraft. Although that particular bill could have been much, much higher if US submarines waiting offshore hadn't picked up a number of ditched aircrew, and on the last day of the operation, with no particular aerial opposition to speak of, a Kingfisher float plane had even landed inside Truk Lagoon itself to pick up the pilot of a Hellcat from the USS Essex, which had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and forced to ditch immediately out at sea. Spruance was advised of his promotion to a 4-star billet, and after refueling, he would take some of the battleships back to help out the Eno landings, which were just about getting underway, while at the same time he ordered Mitchell to head west, the deepest into Japanese-held territory the US Navy had ever gone with intent. Seishan, Tinian, and Guam had just been added to the strike roster, and the carrier pilots would have 3 days rest while they were in transit before it would be time to get back into action. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pin post for dry do questions.